Failed diplomacy, the U-2 spy plane incident by Nicholas Capri. It was May 1960 in the height of the Cold War, when diplomatic relations between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America were volatile because of the competition of the space race and other things. The relationship had been improving ever since the 1955 Geneva Summit and continued to improve with Khrushchev's 1960 visit to America, intended to promote a possible U.S.-USSR friendship. A second summit meeting was scheduled between the two superpowers in Paris, France, for May 16th of the same year. France would serve almost as a middleman, neutral, but would participate in some of the agreements. United States President Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev would both be there. Unfortunately, relations between the two countries would be ruined and the Cold War's end would not be in sight. The actions that would transpire in Soviet territory, committed by Francis-Gary Powers in the USA, could not be forgiven by the Soviets. It would be the final straw. The action taken by America would cause much debate and ruin future relations with Cuba, a Soviet ally, forever changing history. The incident would cause the Cuban Missile Crisis by causing tension between the USSR, Cuba's ally, and America. Francis-Gary Powers was flying his U-2 reconnaissance aircraft on mission for the USA's Central Intelligence Agency on May 1, 1960. His mission was to photograph Soviet bases to acquire evidence of Soviet missile advances. At age 31, Powers was relatively new to these types of missions. It was a routine flight, but Powers was flying at a lower altitude than normal when an orange flash caused his plane to spin out of control. He climbed out of the plane and safely parachuted to the ground near Sverdlovsk, USSR, where he was taken by Soviet citizens to a police station. The police then handed him over to the military. Sentenced to 10 years in prison, he did not even serve 2 before he was exchanged for KGB agent Colonel Rudolf Abel. Diplomatic relations between the two countries would never be the same after this turmoil. This mission, Operation Overflight, was approved 4 years earlier by United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower. However, the Soviets knew of the flights almost from the onset. The first flight on July 4, 1957, yielded excellent results. The Soviets could do nothing to the American planes because they could fly around 70,000 feet, out of range of the Soviets' surface-to-air missiles. Over time, the president became less optimistic of the flights and the possibility of getting shot down. Eisenhower said, "Sooner or later, one of these things is going to get shot down." The U-2 was essentially a glider with a jet engine and 80-foot wingspan that would allow it to fly at incredibly high altitudes for up to 9 hours. In this case, however, Powers was flying low and was said by the Soviets to be shot down by a surface-to-air missile. The plane had a self-destruct mechanism, and Powers was equipped with means to commit suicide, if necessary, in order to prevent the Soviets from acquiring information. The mission was designed to photograph Soviet military bases to see what missile advances were being made, and was also designed to see if the Soviets could uphold their threats of nuclear and non-nuclear long-distance missiles. The flight started in Adana, Turkey, and from there, Powers flew to a CIA airfield in Peshawar, Pakistan. After that, Powers would fly over and photograph Dushanbe, Stalingrad, the Tyurtan Cosmodrome, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Kirov, Archangel, Kandalakasha, Murmansk, and end the flight in Bodo, Norway. After the plane was downed, neither the CIA nor the U.S. State Department knew where Powers was. They could only guess that he was behind schedule or on the ground. After some waiting, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev issued a statement that the plane had been down in the USSR. However, Khrushchev withheld the information that he had the pilot alive and the wreckage of the plane. This caused the U.S. State Department to issue a cover story the State Department believing the pilot and the plane were destroyed. The U.S.'s cover story stated that the downed aircraft was a NASA weather plane collecting weather patterns when it accidentally strayed into Soviet territory. After this statement was issued, Khrushchev took a huge diplomatic offensive and issued a counter-statement. The USSR has an American pilot alive, as well as his plane's wreckage. He had caught them lying. The newspapers exploded with the story. It was on the front page of every newspaper. The New York Times headline was "Crisis in the Cold War." Khrushchev displayed the wreckage in Moscow and proceeded to rant against the United States government, calling the act an intrusion and provocative. Infuriated, Khrushchev said, "We will shoot these planes down." And how can an agreement be sought when the government of one of the great powers declares bluntly that its policy is intrusion into the territory of another great power with espionage and sabotage purposes, and consequently the heightening of tension in relations among states? Taking the offensive a little far, he demanded a direct apology from President Eisenhower. Eisenhower took full responsibility for the act, but would not apologize due to his feeling of obligation to his country. Khrushchev stormed out of the summit and abruptly ended it. Overall, the intrusion of Soviet airspace was unnecessary and untimely. It was too close to the summit. If the plane had not been shot down, or if it was shot down earlier and allowed time for healing and compromise, relations between the two superpowers may still have been healthy. Instead, the relationship could not be refreshed until years later. The United States citizens were disappointed with the government's poor judgment, even though they knew the Soviets were not to be trusted. Many Americans wished the pilot would have destroyed the plane and committed suicide, and therefore not leaving behind any concrete evidence for the Soviets. The citizens also questioned the recruitment requirements. What was the level of secrecy? How many years of service were required? Why was a simple Iowa farm boy entrusted with such a vital mission? The people had good reason for their scrutiny. The United States of America's government should not have allowed the intrusion to happen so close to the 1960 Paris summit. The tension caused by the U-2 spy plane incident, as well as competition between capitalism and communism, ultimately led to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the continuation of the Cold War. If the plane was not shot down, the Soviets may not have supplied their fellow communist Castro with nuclear missiles. The U.S. may have also been able to gain the USSR's trust, and in turn, they could have helped the U.S. negotiate with Cuba. Cuba may have been more willing to compromise if the U.S. had the USSR's trust. This would have ended the war effort for the Bay of Pigs, saving lives, money, and relations between all three countries. If the plane was not shot down, the United States and Russia's present diplomatic relations may be stronger. This act by the United States of America is the epitome of failed diplomacy.